Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords, and today I'm here to talk to you about some good old time religion. That's why I've got here Dark Albion and Lords of Olympus, because I'm going to talk about how pretty much every fantasy setting, almost every fantasy setting, not Dark Albion obviously, gets religion wrong in fantasy settings. Now, I will, so that's why I've got here, well, aside from a cat's tail, I have an example of a monotheist context and then a polytheist context with Lords of Olympus over here. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that obviously, if you're playing a fantasy setting that's meant to be purely fantasy, then you can do whatever you like, right? It doesn't really matter. But my point is that the generic sort of fantasy settings that we see used in most D&D campaigns and published settings and things like that, they tend to, whether it's polytheist or monotheist, which hardly any of them do, they get it all kind of wrong. So I'm going to talk about how you could try to make your setting or the setting you're playing, change the setting you're playing to make it more right. But before I do that, I want to mention again that if you haven't already, if this is the first time you're watching, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you actually get notifications, though apparently sometimes that even doesn't work. So I had someone the other day that my last video, when it came out, apparently they didn't get notified in spite of having rung the bell, but it's the best we can do it these days. And if you end up liking this video, please share it everywhere, because that's a huge help. And then if you want to help me out financially, then, I do have a Patreon page and a PayPal, but the best way to help me out if you want to send a few bucks, the best way for you anyways, I would say, is to check out my products. Check out my games like Dark Albion and Lords of Olympus, but also check out my RPG Pundit Presents PDF series. There's a new PDF out every week, and they range in price from like as low as 99 cents to $4.99, and you get something back in exchange for that. So you're giving me a tip. You're encouraging me to keep going, to make more stuff, to produce more games, and to do more videos. And at the same time, you get something really interesting for yourself, because all of the, I think, 84 issues now of RPG Pundit Presents have material that you can use in your games, whether it's medieval authentic stuff or kind of gonzo and weird fantasy stuff. Some of them are adventures, some of them are mechanics, source books, new magic systems. There's all kinds of things in there. The latest one is the Weird Fantasy Race Generator, which is a 40-page book, one of the biggest ones we've done so far, that is full of tables and mechanics for you to create, to use, random generation, or you can pick and choose from the tables, to create strange fantasy races that you can use as NPCs or as player characters that are not the typical, elf, dwarf, halfling. And they're great for gonzo fantasy, for weird fantasy, for strange continents, for places that are, micro environments in your setting. Or if you just want to, you're making a new setting, you want to introduce some unusual fantasy races. If you do it by the tables and you roll it up randomly, you will never get the same result twice, because there's just too many variations. It's full of stuff. It's a very complete book that'll let you generate interesting and new fantasy races for as long as you have it. So anyways, that's it for our little commercial. I wanted to put that out in the front there. And now back onto the topic. So in most fantasy settings that we see for, say, D&D, what you have is polytheism, right? Like a pantheon of gods, or several pantheons of gods in some settings. Now, before I get to that, I'm going to talk about monotheism, because it's more rare, and that's something that probably could have its own, you could probably do a full episode about that, and maybe I will sometime, but today I'm just going to touch on it very lightly, which is to say, first of all, the main thing I want to say about that is what follows. If you're trying to do a medieval authentic fantasy setting, if you're trying to do a setting that is really meant to be like the Middle Ages, then really you have to have monotheistic religion. Because if you don't, none of the rest of the cultural paradigm of the medieval period, medieval Europe anyways, will actually fit. It just wouldn't make sense in a polytheistic world. So you want to keep that in mind. If you think you've played medieval authentic settings, like medieval fantasy settings, but there's been like, the typical pantheon of D&D gods, you haven't actually done that. I've got a misbehaving cat over here. She's attacking a calendar. Here, I'm going to put you over there. All right. So that's the main thing I wanted to say in this video about monotheism. The other thing I was going to say is that if you're doing medieval authentic fantasy, you have to go one step further, which is that it can't just be a monotheistic religion that dominates your setting. You might have some weird little pagan groups, sects, revivalisms in the borderlands of the border regions of your setting, or you might have some strange heresies and cults hiding in the shadows of your setting, some pagan survivalisms in the countryside. But there would be one dominant religion, and it would be an organized religion. It has to be the church, right? If you don't have the church, it doesn't necessarily have to be the Christian church, but it has to be something similar enough that you don't lose the rest of the cultural paradigm. Now, if you're not playing in a medieval European fantasy setting, then you probably don't need it to be monotheist, but having a monotheist religion in your setting will make your setting, it'll set your setting apart from all the other ones, right? Your players are used to games where you have, in Greyhawk or the Forgotten Realms or whatever, there's all these different gods, all these different pantheons. And if you make your setting a world where there's like just the one god or one dominant religion that's monotheist in nature, because the big religions tend to have a monotheist element to them, then you'll really make your setting seem different than all the others. And that's in and of itself something that could be of great interest for a campaign if you've got a group of kind of jaded players that are used to the settings, the more conventional settings. I could also go into talking about like having more of the unusual sort of philosophical religions, the Eastern settings, Gnosticism or Buddhism or Taoism or all that stuff. But I think that kind of goes outside. If I don't want to end up making this like a 2-hour video, which I do not, I think it goes outside of the scope of that. And maybe I'll do another video about that. So the main thing, though, that I really wanted to cover in this video is polytheism. Because the complaint that I have to make isn't just, D&D fantasy claims to be medieval fantasy, but it's full of polytheism. That's one thing, but a completely separate but equally important problem is that polytheism as presented in D&D settings is basically wrong, right? They don't do it correctly. So, for a start, regions will have single dominant pantheons, and what you often see in these medieval fantasy, these fake medieval fantasy settings that you see in the conventional kind of D&D worlds, is that you sometimes see like these mishmashes of different pantheons being together in the same place. That might happen with like minority groups in certain major cosmopolitan, bases in cities and things like that, especially where there's a lot of trade. But otherwise, you would have one pantheon to a region, the gods that are worshipped there, right? The gods of that particular culture. Worse still, though, is how the religion is treated in the game. Now let me set this up for you, right? You're playing D&D, and when you play D&D, let's say you make a gaming party, and in that party you have, let's say, one cleric, right? That's not unusual. And so that's going to be a cleric of one of the gods, right? I don't know, Torm, right? Or St. Cuthbert, or whoever. And that cleric, all they care about is Torm or St. Cuthbert. And then the rest of the party pretty much doesn't pay any real attention to the gods, right? Like the others, for all you know, they're agnostic, right? That's a very typical D&D group today, right? Where the only one that gives a damn about religion is the cleric, and the cleric gives a damn about religion because it gives him special powers, right? And sometimes in a lot of these games, the cleric won't be seen doing anything to do with their god except praying every day to get their spells and then casting those spells, right? And maybe, if it's a slightly more sophisticated party, following the basic tenets of what that god is about, right? But this is not the way that you should present if you're trying to in any way reflect human culture, human anthropology, and human history, a polytheistic culture. What you need to have, first of all, is a pantheon. Like in the D&D worlds, you usually have a pantheon of gods where you have, this is the god of fire, this is the god of death, this is the god of the sun, this is the god of the moon, here's the god of healing, this one's the god of the undead, or something like that, right? Like you have all these specific portfolios, and this is even reflected in a lot of the D&D systems rules and OSR rules, where you have like these different divine portfolios, and that's what that god covers and what they do. And then you have another god that covers one specific thing, and that's what they do. Now, this is almost never reflected in historical pantheons. In a historical pantheon, you have gods that are the product of many centuries or thousands of years sometimes of different periods, developments. They're often mishmashes of previous deities that have kind of been fused together into one, deities from different regions that got kind of combined into one, and things like that. So if you want, your first tip in terms of how to design the gods themselves is that they should have much more complex areas of interest. If you look, for example, at the Greek pantheon, you have, Poseidon, for example. Well, he's the god of the sea, right? You'd think, well, there you are. This is the obvious example of a god that looks like he fits the D&D mold. Except Poseidon, for example, is also the god of horses. Why? Well, there's a lot of explanations for that, but that's what he is. And then you have Apollo, right? Apollo's the god of the sun. Everyone knows that. But Apollo's also the god of music. He's the god of poetry. He's the god of medicine. He's basically the god of civilization, right? So he's the god of beauty, right? He's a god that encompasses a whole bunch of different areas that don't necessarily seem to have anything immediately connected to them, right? And you see it gets even worse when you look at someone like Hermes, right? Hermes is like, he's the god with all the portfolios you can imagine, right? He's the god of shepherds, the god of thieves, the god of gamblers, the god of magicians and magic. He's the god that interacts with spirits of the dead. He's the god of business. He's the god of making bargains. He's got all of these different areas. The god of knowledge and of students and of education. He's the god of speed and therefore of runners and messengers. There's like this big mishmash of stuff that he covers. And except for very minor demigods, you very rarely see a god that only has one subject, right? Like one topic that they cover. Usually it's this mix of things that don't necessarily, at least without doing some very complex sort of symbolic acrobatics, like I'm sure a Jungian approach would see a connection between these different things, and so did certain, pre-modern occult systems would say, well, all those things that Apollo covers are covered by the larger and deeper mystical symbolism of the sun or something like that. Okay, sure, fine. But in a practical sense, it really looks like they cover a bunch of different stuff. So you want your pantheons to be very much less organized and rational than they typically are in a D&D setting. That's the first mistake a designer of a D&D setting does when they try to do polytheistic pantheons. They because you're writing them from nothing, you're making them in such a way that is very orderly and sensible, but historical pantheons were never all that orderly and sensible. So you want to have them more varied. The second thing is that in D&D settings, when it happens to come up, who do your characters worship other than clerics, right? Who do your non-clerics characters worship? You'll tend to get something like, well, my guy's a warrior, so he worships Tyr, the god of warriors, and my guy's a wizard, so he worships whoever the goddess of wizardry or the god of wizardry is in that setting, right? And stuff like that. And that's never actually how it went in a polytheistic society. You look at this even today. Go to India, right? And in India, you have a pantheon of gods that are in fact several historical pantheons that have been kind of mashed together with gods that have changed over time to have a lot of different areas of specialty, right? So that, for example, you take a character like Shiva, right? Shiva as a god he's the god of magic, the god of drugs, the god of wild places, the god of sex, the god of death, the god of dancing, right? There it is again, right? This big mishmash of stuff. And then in India, you're going to see in different regions, people will favor certain gods. Like there are places where kind of the big gods of the area are Brahma and Krishna, right? And in other areas, it might be Shiva and Kali, right? Like there's a lot of regional variation where certain gods are going to be more important to certain regions than others. And this happened in the classical European world too, right? Like, you had cities that were dedicated to certain gods, obviously Athena in Athens, Artemis in Ephesus, stuff like that. And so there are certain places where certain gods will be more important than in other places. But most importantly, like if you go to India today, you might meet some people, like lay people. I'm not talking about priests here. You might meet some lay people that are super devoted. Somebody is especially devoted to Ganesha, right? And they really love Ganesha. But they also practice devotion to all the other gods, especially starting with the ones most important for the region, and then the other ones, like just because Rama isn't big in your neighborhood, you're still going to be devoted to Rama, right? You're devoted to all of them because they're all gods, right? And it doesn't, you won't have this situation that you see sometimes in RPGs where if your guy is a non-cleric and he's a devotee, he's a devotee of one god, that's the only god that matters to them. No, that's not polytheism then. That's like a kind of weird pre-monotheism, right? You're saying, well, this is the only god that's important. That's not how it worked. People in the everyday world in ancient Greece and Rome would go around doing veneration to different gods for different purposes. There would be the gods of their family. There would be the gods that they would engage in. Before you might do a dedication at the temple of Hermes before beginning a new business, and then you'd get a blessing from Apollo if your family was sick, if someone in your family was sick, and you'd be working with all of them. So you have to create a world where to each person all of the gods are equally important, and you would be engaged in that practice, right? In that interest in them. Even clerics. Clerics were obviously would be the priests of a specific god. But they would also inevitably have to be interacting with the other gods as well in some degree, right? Like just because you're primarily, let's say you're primarily a priest of Horus, it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be times when you have to deal with Maat or with Isis, or whoever else. So you have to create a setting where the polytheistic gods are complex, and where the society as a whole engages with all of the gods as a whole, right? Being a priest of a god means, of course, you have a very, very special relationship with a specific god, right? And this should be, priests should always have specific things that are required of them. In a monotheistic setting, you end up having an institution usually of some kind, right? Whether it's a very hierarchical and controlled and centralized institution like the Catholic Church was in the Middle Ages, or whether it's slightly less centralized institutions like what you saw in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages. But you have orders and there are rules that have to be followed, and these should be very explicit, and you have to respond to people, right, to your superiors, and you might have to direct inferiors. And at the same time, one of the big powers a cleric should have in any setting where the gods are real, which remember, in the pre-modern world, people thought of the gods as real. The problem is in our world, even today, even though there are a lot of people that claim to be, religious believers, our paradigm itself does not place the divine in that sort of central position anymore. So we have a hard time putting this into our heads, right? That the social cachet of people who could speak to the gods, right? Of priests, clerics, whatever you want to call them, is huge, right? One of the most important special abilities of any priest or cleric should be their social influence. And I make a big deal of that, for example, in the Dark Albion setting in Lion and Dragon. If you've bought some of my adventure supplements from RPG Pundit Presents, you'll see that in any part of the adventure, the characters are going off to some shithole in the wilderness, right? They're trying to to resolve some problem and what have you. And I always write there, I make a point of saying, okay, so in this situation, you run into this group, of soldiers, or you run into this knight, or you go to this village, and if the party has a cleric with them, this and this and this will happen, right? And so there will be a different treatment to people. Hey, it's Big Chungus. Look at this. There'll be a different treatment of people if you've got a cleric around, because the cleric has special social cachet that other people don't. So as a final note, what I want to mention is too that there should be a much stricter difference between magic users and clerics. In the typical D&D setting, we often end up with a situation where clerics and magic users are both just kind of spellcasters, right? And they have, one is arcane spells, the other one's divine spells, but in a practical sense of the setting, they're the treatment of them is not particularly different from the people in the setting. With a few, maybe there are a few exceptions. Maybe some areas where there's a, like in some published settings, there's a place that's a theocracy, and so their clerics are super important. Usually the theocracy is presented in a very negative light. And then some other place, there might be a place like, I don't know, like Fae, where there's an order of wizards that rules everything, and then they have all the power, but then, any other wizards aren't treated well anyways. But, in terms of trying to make a credible context, there's a very big difference in any place in the world where there was, at any point in history, in any society or culture, where there was a priesthood on the one hand, and then some kind of order of magicians, whether it was exorcists or soothsayers, or your classic kind of dabblers in wizardry, or wise wise magisters of some kind, right? People who were sages that also were said to know some magical powers. All of these things, those were two very, very different things, right? Basically, wizards in any place were one of two things. They were either a fallback to a more primitive kind of ancient practice, right? Like basically a leftover from the shamans, right? So you had in China, you had these orders of Confucian and Taoist and Buddhist monks, and then you had like the Wu, which were these shamans and exorcists that you'd call up if you thought your house had ghosts in it, right? To come and do an exorcism. And so it's a very different attitude that gets looked at there, and very different people that would appeal to it. That was very lowbrow, right? Like lower class magic, right? And then on the other hand, you have the other side is that usually they're seen as scholars, people of knowledge, right? Wizards should have, if you want to do it really right, wizards should probably have a lot of knowledge skills that have nothing to do with magic, because magic should be a product in the sense of, apart from that sort of exorcist and soothsayer stuff, most of the times a wizard, what they should be, are people that have studied the mysteries of the universe and are manipulating the mysteries of the universe to create effects, which is to say magic. In Lion and Dragon, I make a point of making completely separate styles of powers for clerics and wizards, right? Like neither of them are exactly the Vancian magic system, but clerics have a set of powers that they get to use on a regular basis, based on prayer and things like that. And magic in Lion and Dragon is based on the old medieval grimoires, and so it's a lot of ritual magic and making of talismans and potions, alchemy and astrology and all that sort of stuff, which usually isn't stuff that you can just cast in the middle of a battlefield. Though maybe if you prepare stuff beforehand, you can then use it in the middle of a battle. So the point is, I think one of the great problems for the treatment of clerical versus wizardly magic, and therefore this spills over into how they're seen in a setting as being basically the same, just slightly different takes on the same thing, is that the magic system in D&D is the same for both of them. There's a lot of spells that are crossed over. Yeah, clerics get healing and wizards don't, and wizards have slightly better combat powers, though nowadays it's not so much true. But having the same magic system leads you to think that they're just, wizards are just like priests without portfolio, right? They're priests that don't serve a god, right? Or something like that, but basically it's the same stuff. That's not really how it would have been looked at in ancient and medieval cultures. It would be seen as two very different things. Now, that means wizards sometimes might be very, very respected in their own areas, right? They'd be respected as learned sages. They'd also probably be more distrusted by some people, right? Whereas if you have the authority of the gods, right, or of the church, then that gives you a level of respectability that is much more, beyond repute, right? You can't argue with that. So, yeah, that's basically what I wanted to cover today. The main points I think I've covered about polytheist religions and how you could make them different, right? Make your pantheons more messy, and make sure that you make a big point. In any polytheistic society, the polytheistic society works because everyone is constantly thinking about all the gods, right? Like the gods are all over the place, and there should be a lot of little elements of regular worship and interaction, and that the characters should always believe in all the gods, and not, you wouldn't see in a polytheist society, apart from a priest, someone who was dedicated completely to just one god and never paid attention to any of the others. They would all be recognized, right? Even the bad ones would be recognized, though you would treat them with a lot of fear and mistrust unless you dedicated yourself to them, in which case you would become a fearsome person, right? So yeah, that's everything for today. Again, remember to share this video if you liked it. I hope you do. And sharing is a great way to help promote the video, because odds are I'm not being promoted by YouTube. Thank you to everyone who's subscribed so far. And if you haven't, please feel free to subscribe. And check out those RPG Pundit Presents books and my regular games if you liked what I was talking about here. If you want a great source book on the Greek pantheon, here's Lords of Olympus, which is a full RPG, a diceless RPG, a very interesting RPG. But even if you never play it, you're going to find that it's probably got the most in-depth source material in any RPG for the Greek pantheon, and how to how to portray and what each of the gods, including some that you've probably never heard of that were parts of the Greek pantheon, are all about. So yeah, check that all out. See you next time. Currently smoking Ben Wade Rhodesian plus Image Latakia.